your podcast and YouTube blog covering the German startup scene with news, interviews, and live events.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Joe from Startuprad.io, your startup podcast and YouTube blog from the German-speaking area. Today, you are not only participating in a special publication, you are participating in the launch of a new sub-podcast together with a deep ecosystem. Talking about this, Thomas, I would like to welcome you back again.
Thank you very much, Joe. Hi here, Thomas from Deep Ecosystems and the Startup Heatmap.
Totally my pleasure to have you here. Thomas, I have to tell you, when we keep doing this on a quarterly basis, you're soon going to unthrone Paolo Cironi as our most frequent guest.
I'm sorry, Paolo.
Okay, that's it. We are starting now the pulse of the European startup ecosystem. This is the installment Q1 2022. We will also pack in this podcast the 2 episodes we did before. It will be available on our main podcast and each fitting sub-podcast. If you're only interested in a bird's eye view of the European startup ecosystem, that is what you should look for, pulse of the European startup ecosystem. As we said, it's a cooperation between the Deep Ecosystem and Startup Radio on a quarterly basis. Therefore, we once again share data with you that you, Thomas, put together. You want to talk a little bit about who you guys are, what you're doing for everybody who's not familiar with you?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Yes, we are very happy to be part of this initiative, and we are helping the European startup ecosystem to understand where everyone is going, where the hubs are going. We're looking at data every 3 months to understand investment growth, job growth, meetup activity, opportunities for startups, accelerator activity. And we try to put some numbers to all of these developments and all of these opportunities that we see in Europe. The idea is simple. Without knowing what is happening, we can't grow the ecosystem. So we really have the mission to help everyone understand what's going on the ground, what are the opportunities, and then this will help you in turn to position your startup in the right trend sectors, to understand if you're running an accelerator, what is the next big wave of innovation you should get onto. And if you're a policymaker, of course, this helps you to understand how you compare against other cities and countries in the world. So really, it's about understanding what's going on, and we want to share as much data as possible. Deep Ecosystems is an accelerator for ecosystems, so we help ecosystems grow, and the Startup Heatmap is a platform where you can find all our data publicly available to browse and to learn which are the hottest startup hubs in Europe, what are the best places to grow a startup, and more.
And from my background, I would also say potential users are investment banks and consultancies that are always looking for interesting new startup, or on behalf of the client, where to start, for example, a new office. We should also hint that you guys are going to have an event pretty soon from this publication day on. It's the 23rd and 24th of June, my understanding, right?
That's absolutely correct. We are in Stuttgart, in Ludwigsburg, which is close to Stuttgart. And there we will have a great event for everyone interested in building ecosystems. We will have great speakers from Robert Bosch company, from Multiple Capital, a niche geography and niche vertical investor. We have great people from all different places in the world. We have Joe with us. So if you want to be featured in the Startup Radio, definitely you can snag an interview there. So yeah, I think it's going to be a great event. And if you want to, come to deepecosystems.com and get your ticket.
Awesome. Hitting the report you call Startup City Signals right now. It's Q1 2022. It's of course very interesting, and there is again a lot we could talk about. But I'm sure we both decide that this is that we want to keep it short for everybody who's watching this on YouTube. You can see the data. For everybody who's not able to see it because it's an audio podcast, or you listen to us on one of our own or syndication radio station, go to medium.com/startuprad-io, and there you'll find the blog post related to this publication. And there's also an additional report you get exclusively just for our audience. And that is what we're going through now. What I found interesting is the headlines. Startups in Europe raises 28.2 billion US dollars in just one quarter, Q1 2022. It's the second highest quarterly volume on record. I was wondering, is this a leading indicator, so it's going to be awesome, or a lagging indicator? Well, we already had a lot of stuff, and now just the next step.
Yes, that's actually really a crazy number. If you think about it, we're coming out of a pandemic. We are really in a difficult situation when you look at the stock market as well. We have a war wagering in Europe, and still the investments have gone up in Q1 2022, record quarter. That's pretty solid. And if you look at the timeline, you see that the last quarters have been the strongest, right? Throughout the pandemic, we have seen a lot of investments in startups, and I think that's showing that the startup ecosystem has a solid base in Europe. It's not the small brother anymore of let's say the US ecosystem, but it really has a good positioning now, and there is recurring success cases. And we see, of course, also very big rounds happening that drive up the number to the billions. And here, 28.2 billion, that is really a lot. So we do see that there is really a solid increase compared to the previous years. Nevertheless, your question is very valid, saying, does that mean that it will stay like this forever? And that's a big question mark, because of course we see a lot of mega rounds now into startups that are also driven by recent developments. So you see a lot of investments in delivery startups and e-commerce, etc., because of the dramatic changes of how we live and how our consumer behavior changed throughout the pandemic. The question is, will these startups actually succeed in the long run, or were these bets that were taken into these by the investors delusional and basically will break down in a few months? And that could mean that some of the investors that gave these mega rounds its volume, they decide, no, I'm not investing anymore in this kind of levels and volumes, and then we will see that the numbers will go down again. So it might be actually the opposite as we expected. While many were thinking in the pandemic investments will slow down, actually it drove it up, and remains to be seen whether that will stay on that high level. I would say, to understand how healthy our ecosystem is, we need to look at a lot of other indicators. For example, the activity on the ground, the Meetup activity, the opportunities for startups, the early stage investments, right? There's a lot of elements that we need to look at to understand if we actually have a healthy development of our ecosystem, or if it's just the mega rounds that boost up the numbers and we all say, yay, it's great. But indeed, this is maybe just a hype that passes.
It comes down to yay or nay. Before we get into the other signals, if this is a healthy development, I also put in a Crunchbase article just published about a week ago at the time of recording this on May 11th. 2022, funding to EU startups slows sharply after brisk start in 2022, and they are talking about March and April declining after January and February has been good. This is a little bit different because you guys have a different database and you guys have a different time frame. So the article talks about Crunchbase. The article talks about everything until April, and we are only talking about March here. But did you see a similar development? Do you think we're just ahead of a cliff?
So yeah, the article you shared by Crunchbase was looking specifically at the large numbers, the large rounds that we just mentioned. Basically, they found that in the last 2 months in Europe, we saw fewer rounds above 100 million than we had seen in the beginning of the year. That is very interesting because normally Q2 is one of these strong months, the quarters. So normally you would expect an increase quarter over quarter. There's a lot of seasonality in investments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you see that normally the beginning of the year is a little bit weaker, then Q2 gets a bit stronger, summer is weaker, and then Q3 and Q4 are actually quite strong normally. And Q2 is normally one where we expect very large rounds to come in. And the opposite seems to be true if we look at the very recent numbers now. There is a few different explanations at play. Some say, okay, just because there is like the war going on in Ukraine, you might postpone the publication and announcement of large rounds because it might not fit the news cycle at the moment, and it doesn't feel like a celebration time, and you don't want to come off as someone that doesn't care about what's going on in the world. So it might be just like the announcement dates that are being moved. That remains to be seen after Q2 finishes, and maybe we see more announcement in Q3 and it catches up again. But in principle, it's an interesting sign, and specifically speaking to the fact that I mentioned before that the pandemic drove up large rounds, and maybe now also a bit of the dry powder is used up, and maybe we see a normalization of the activity again. In principle, that doesn't mean though that in terms of volumes we have to expect a decline. I think that we are still on a growth path. Also here, the article of Crunchbase mentions that we saw an increase in Q1. They have a bit of a different way of counting. To be honest, I'm not such a big fan of how they did that because they include post-IPO data. And I would say at some point we need to stop to call something a startup. And especially once it is on the stock market and IPO'd, I would not count that kind of capital investment as a startup investment anymore. So I would cut at latest at the IPO stage. But in this analysis, they did this a bit differently, and of course, that is then showing also more the overall stock market trends, which are difficult in this period. So, of course, there was like not as much of increase if you take in the stock market development.
Mm-hmm. I really like your interactive graphics here because the sum of investments per quarter, you can see all of Europe, but you can also look at Barcelona, London, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, and Stockholm separately. I find this very awesome. We do have a few big rounds. We're not going to go into them. As I said in the beginning, before we start the recording, there is a little bit missing because you also had your decision points, how you included this data. For example, Volocopter and Hydrogen from Frankfurt Rhine-Main area, they are not in there, even though they raised 200 million euros and 150 million US dollars, I believe, for Volocopter. I'm not sure about the currency. Respectively, they're not included because you do have a little bit a different frame of reference there, right?
Yes, in the top rounds, we were looking now only at the rounds up to 100 million, which was just a decision to how to list this, because at some point you need to make a cut, and you don't want to show always the same startups. Though I must say, Hydrogen from North Hessen is one of the surprising players here with 200 million out of nothing. So congratulations to them. Definitely worth a mention on the side.
We will have an interview coming up with them sometime in late summer or fall, the publication. Actually, I would also suggest there is a Startuprad.io indicator, which may not function as properly as I wish, because obviously I'm getting more popular, I'm getting more requests. But if you would ask me for an interview right now, admittedly, I only accept 2% of the people requesting an interview. You would need to think about publication in October, if you don't have a fixed spot like you guys. And therefore, I do believe, that is also a very good indicator that there's still a lot going on in the startup ecosystem. For me, especially the German-speaking area, GSA or DACH region, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. Okay, I'm talking about the startups here, the vertical development, performance number of deals, and on one side you have deals since 2019, and on the right, on the lower axis you have deals of the last 6 months. So this is the vertical axis, deals since 2019, and I found the hot sectors are, of course, fintech, deep tech, health, AI, and data. That is basically the stable growth sector. The upcoming growth sector has nothing in there, the slowing growth sector as well. Yeah. I was wondering what is, like, pardon my language, the hottest shit here, because I've seen consumer apps, they've been a little bit declining. What is that here? That one is not working like I wanted to. Clean tech, for example. There are some that are very much in focus of media attention right now, and that may or may not give them a push there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's quite interesting to see that we have a lot of stability in the verticals. That's always surprising when you look at the data and you compare it to, let's say, the media attention. So, for example, fintech is out here as one of the most stable growth sectors. It's in absolute numbers the second biggest, next to deep tech, which we must admit deep tech is much broader, right? But it's also surprising now that you see deep tech as a category being the biggest sector in Europe. So fintech being both the second largest and then the largest growth sector, which means that in the last 6 months it had over even more than it had before, right? Proportionally. That means we see even a growth in fintech that we don't see in other sectors. By the magnitude that you can see here on the chart, you have many more deals coming into fintech than you have, for example, in clean tech. So that's just the reality how it is, and it's growing the fastest. The upcoming growth sectors box is empty because there is not like a shooting star that suddenly went through the roof in the last 6 months and had many more deals. So you see that clean tech is moving in this direction, but it's really not to the magnitude that you'd say there was like a complete change of heart with investors and they doubled or tripled their investments in this space. It just didn't happen like that. So there is an increase, but it's not as dramatic as we maybe wanted. So definitely a growth sector, yes. It's a bit mean that we call it laggards down here. If you compare it to fintech, definitely a laggard. It's not comparable at all to the magnitude of investments in fintech, and even at the deal number, not only the mega rounds, it's not the volumes. This is about the individual deals that we see. It's lagging. And that's, of course, not where we want it to be, right? If we see and all the vision for Europe becoming a leader in sustainability and climate tech, it's not where we want it to be. More encouraging is the deep tech space. Well, that definitely is something where you see an edge. And I would also be quite confident in international comparison to other continents. Europe would have like a unique selling proposition here. Deep tech is definitely a very strong sector in our continent.
Mm-hmm. Also very encouraging are the jobs numbers, because job growth are startup creating jobs, and I've seen for more than 50,000 additional jobs. I think it's almost like 60,000 in first quarter, more than 20,000 in January 22. 12,000, almost 13,000 in February 22, and almost, a little bit over 24, let's say 25,000 in March 22, which is just amazing. You show plus 90% job growth there. If I would be a politician, I would totally jump on this opportunity. Have you any background on this development? Was it something like they now got the big funding and now they generate the jobs? They need the people to get their work done?
Yes, I think that is definitely true. You see that also the sectors that hire the most are fintech, health, and biotech. And then logistics, which is of course including all of the delivery startups. So you see that they also create a lot of jobs. So definitely you will have that that development after big rounds. You will see also hiring, because it is necessarily so that in many of the deals, the startups that we see, personnel is one of the big cost factors. So the investments would give you a budget to hire, and then you will have these job openings following suit. Definitely, it's the case. One interesting observation, by the way, is that sometimes we see the connection between the geography of the investment with the geography of the job creation not align very well. So, for example, London is the biggest in in investment growth, but in job creation, it's actually not the biggest. So you see other cities that are outperforming London in job growth, and I think that's a sign that London is really the place where you raise funding, but where your startup headquarters is and where your people are hired, that's a totally different story.
I also had in mind the remote working, completely remote jobs. They're totally okay since the outbreak of the pandemic. Thomas, I have to tell you another thing. If you agree with everything I say, this is going to be a very boring recording. Yes. And then we do have a little bit the Meetup activity. You kind of see it as a leading indicator for startup activity in the respective places, but it currently looks like it's all going down a little bit. Is this normal for the first quarter, for the beginning of the year, or is it just an effect we see here, maybe still due to Corona?
Yeah, definitely that's one of these effects. We saw again, which was interesting during the pandemic, participation in meetups actually increased. And that was interesting because no one was expecting that. Basically, people were saying the meetup scene will suffer a lot and the possibility for founders to meet and exchange will decrease. But what happened is that actually the meetups went online and people from also other places were able to join these meetups. And that gave a boost to participation overall in meetups. People were bored at home, and what they did was joining meetups. And they did so especially in the big hubs. So they went to London online, they joined a meetup in Berlin online. They went, for example, to Stockholm, which was one of the places that went really through the roof during the pandemic in terms of meetup participation. They attracted a lot of international visitors. And I think now, after the pandemic ended, we see a bit of a normalization of that trend. We see that meetups are happening in person again, and of course that limits a bit the number of participants in the meetups, because they're not so international anymore, and we're going down in participation level.
Mm-hmm. Sounds pretty good. One more question for you, because we're getting at the end opportunities. How active is the European startup scene? That is an aggregation of different things like accelerators, access to corporates, and so on and so forth. I have seen it's once again exactly at the level of Q1 2021. When do you think we are going to be back at the levels of 2019 pre-corona?
So opportunities are driven so these are calls for accelerators, these are calls for funding, prices, etc. And
it's basically a message that goes, are there any awesome startups that do this and that?
Exactly. So someone puts some funding up and a prize money and says, I want to meet the best startup in AI or in agri-tech or whatever, and you can apply, right? So might be an accelerator program, might be just funding, might be just a call for joining a conference, etc. And we're tracking this, and we're showing these opportunities on the Startup Heatmap platform for founders to apply to. And basically here you see each quarter it's around 100, 120 when it's a big one. And then you saw like a bit of a slowdown in Q3 and Q4 2021. Q1 again at a 100. I think that this has to do also with the attention to the early stage that has declined. A lot of actors are moving later stage, corporates and also public entities on the European level. They say they want to move to the later stage and only work with startups that already are on the market, already have a product, etc. And we see a bit of a less attention on early stage startups, and so that's why levels are where they are. And I would wish personally that there would be even more opportunities, because 100 opportunities per quarter, that's for Europe, that's not enough in my opinion.
Exactly. And there's also a link in the document where all the people who have calls for applications for solutions from startup can actually add in their opportunities.
Exactly.
Thomas, it was a pleasure talking to you again. Looking forward to have you back in the next quarter. Everybody who'd like to reach out that we look at different data, different hubs, something like that, reach out to me, joe@startuprad.io, and we will answer your question. By the way, it would be great if you do it before the next recording so we can accommodate that. Just looking at the calendar, we are right now in May. So let's say 2.5 months after the end of the quarter. So that means we will be back sometime in September, late September, early October, for the next recording.
Fantastic. Looking forward to that. And I hope everyone learned a bit. And if there's questions, let us know.
Awesome. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
That's all, folks. Find more news, streams, events, and interviews at www.startuprad.io. Remember, sharing is caring.